Sarah Mitchell stepped through the glass doors of Henderson and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious law firms. At 24, she looked even younger with her simple ponytail and modest business attire from a department store. The receptionist barely glanced up as Sarah approached the marble desk. "I'm here for the junior associate position interview," Sarah said politely. The receptionist's eyes swept over her dismissively. "Third floor, conference room B, you're early." As Sarah waited in the elegant conference room, she overheard two senior partners talking in the hallway. Another fresh graduate, one scoffed. "These kids think a law degree makes them ready for real cases. This one probably doesn't even know how to handle a traffic violation." When the interview began, the three partners seemed more interested in testing her limits than evaluating her qualifications. Mr. Henderson, the founding partner, leaned back in his leather chair with obvious skepticism. "Miss Mitchell, you have no prior experience at a major firm. How do you expect to handle complex corporate litigation?" His tone suggested he already knew her answer would be inadequate. Sarah maintained her composure. "I believe every lawyer starts somewhere. Mr. Henderson, I've studied extensively and completed internships at smaller practices where I gained hands-on experience." The second partner, Mrs. Chen, interrupted with a condescending smile. "Internships at small-town practices hardly prepare you for what we do here. We handle million-dollar cases, not simple wills and divorces." The third partner, Mr. Rodriguez, added his own dismissive comment. "We need someone who can think on their feet, not someone who needs training wheels." Despite their obvious lack of confidence in her abilities, Sarah answered every question thoroughly and professionally. She discussed legal precedents, case strategies, and demonstrated her knowledge of current corporate law. However, the partners exchanged glances that clearly indicated they had already made up their minds about her. "We'll be in touch," Mr. Henderson said flatly, standing to signal the interview's end. As Sarah gathered her simple briefcase, she heard Mrs. Chen whisper to her colleague, "We need someone with real experience, not another rookie who will need constant supervision." Sarah left the building knowing she had been dismissed before she even had a real chance. The security guard at the front desk gave her a sympathetic nod, having witnessed countless young hopefuls leave with the same defeated expression. Walking to her modest apartment, Sarah reflected on the familiar pattern she had experienced throughout her career. People consistently underestimated her based on her age and appearance. They saw a young woman without an impressive pedigree and assumed she lacked the skills and knowledge to compete at their level. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been carefully building her reputation in a very different world. While other law students were focusing on internships at big firms, Sarah had been quietly working on cases that would make the partners at Henderson and Associates question everything they thought they knew about experience and capability. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "The Morrison case files have been leaked to the press. Emergency meeting tonight at the usual location." Sarah smiled slightly as she deleted the message. The partners at Henderson and Associates had no idea that the inexperienced young woman they had just dismissed was actually someone they would soon be reading about in the morning headlines. Her real work was just beginning, and it had nothing to do with chasing junior associate positions at traditional law firms. The next morning would bring revelations that would shake the legal community and force everyone who had underestimated her to reconsider their assumptions about experience, capability, and the power of being underestimated. 3 days after her disappointing interview, Sarah sat in a small coffee shop across from City Hall, laptop open and several legal documents spread across her table. To any observer, she looked like a typical graduate student working on assignments. The reality was far different. Her secure phone rang with a call from Detective Maria Santos, one of the few people who knew about Sarah's hidden work. "We've got a problem," Detective Santos said without preamble. "The Morrison corruption case is falling apart. Our key witness just recanted his testimony, and the defense team is claiming prosecutorial misconduct." Sarah's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard as she accessed encrypted files. "I've been tracking the witness payments. Give me 2 hours." Meanwhile, at Henderson and Associates, the partners were dealing with their own crisis. The Morrison case involved their biggest corporate client, Westfield Industries, and the corruption charges threatened to destroy the company's reputation and their lucrative contract. Mr. Henderson paced his office while speaking to his senior litigation team. We need someone brilliant on this case. The prosecution seems to have inside information we can't explain. Whoever is helping them knows corporate law better than most of our senior partners." Mrs. Chen reviewed the latest court filings with growing concern. The legal arguments are sophisticated and the evidence gathering is methodical. This isn't the work of typical government lawyers. Someone with serious expertise is behind this. What they didn't realize was that the someone they feared was the same young woman they had dismissed as inexperienced just days earlier. Sarah had spent the past 2 years working as an undercover legal consultant for a federal task force investigating corporate corruption. Her youthful appearance and apparent inexperience made her the perfect infiltrator. While companies and law firms saw her as harmless, she was actually documenting evidence of fraud, bribery, and illegal business practices. Her real credentials were impressive, but completely hidden. She had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, passed the bar exam in 3 states, and had been personally recruited by the Department of Justice for her analytical skills and ability to blend into any environment. The Morrison case was her masterpiece. For 18 months, she had worked as a temporary paralegal at various firms connected to Westfield Industries, gathering evidence while everyone around her treated her like an invisible assistant. Partners would discuss sensitive information freely in front of her, assuming she lacked the knowledge to understand its significance. Sarah's phone buzzed with another secure message. "Federal grand jury meets tomorrow. Final evidence package ready for submission," she responded quickly. "Evidence compiled. Witness protection protocols in place. Ready to proceed." That evening, Sarah attended a community college night class as part of her cover identity. She sat in the back row of a basic legal studies course, taking notes while the instructor explained concepts she had mastered years ago. Several students around her were struggling with homework assignments that Sarah could complete in minutes. After class, a fellow student approached her. "Sarah, could you help me understand contract law? You always seem to get it." Sarah smiled and spent 30 minutes patiently explaining legal principles to her classmate, never revealing that she had written legal briefs that had influenced federal court decisions. As she walked home, Sarah passed the illuminated windows of Henderson and Associates where lights burned late into the night. The partners were probably working frantically to save their client, unaware that their fate had already been sealed by the inexperienced young woman they had rejected tomorrow's. Events would begin a chain reaction that would expose years of corruption and force the legal community to confront the truth about the quiet, unassuming woman who had been hiding in plain sight among them. The morning news broke like a thunderclap across the legal community. Federal agents had executed simultaneous raids on Westfield Industries and 3 major law firms, including Henderson and Associates. The charges were extensive: money laundering, bribery, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud government contracts. Sarah watched the coverage from her apartment while preparing for what would be the most important day of her career. The news anchor's voice filled the room. "Federal prosecutors are calling this the largest corporate corruption case in the state's history, with evidence spanning over 5 years of illegal activities." At Henderson and Associates, chaos reigned. FBI agents carried boxes of documents from the building while reporters crowded the sidewalk. Mr. Henderson stood in his empty office, staring at the spots where his confidential files had been stored just hours earlier. "How did they know exactly where to look?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice shaking. "They went straight to our most sensitive files," Mr. Rodriguez paced frantically. "Someone gave them inside information, but who? We've been so careful about who has access to those documents." The partners had no way of knowing that their careful security had been compromised by someone they had never considered a threat. Sarah had accessed their files months earlier, while working as a temporary administrative assistant, a position so beneath their notice that they never bothered to learn her name. Sarah's secure phone rang with a call from Assistant U.S. Attorney James Morrison, the prosecutor leading the federal task force. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. "Once we announce your role, there's no going back to undercover work." Sarah looked at herself in the mirror, seeing the same young face that had been dismissed by countless lawyers and judges. "I'm ready." The evidence speaks for itself. At the federal courthouse, reporters gathered for what they had been told would be a major announcement about the corruption case. Detective Santos positioned herself near the entrance, knowing that the next few hours would change everything for her young colleague. Inside the courthouse, Sarah met with the prosecution team one final time. The conference room was filled with experienced federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and legal specialists who had been working on the case for years. To most of them, Sarah was still the quiet consultant who had provided research assistance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison began, "before we proceed with today's press conference, I want you to meet the person who made this entire prosecution possible." He gestured toward Sarah, who stood quietly in her simple business suit, looking exactly like the inexperienced young lawyer that everyone assumed her to be. Sarah Mitchell has been working undercover for the past 2 years, infiltrating the network of companies and law firms involved in this corruption scheme. Her work has been extraordinary, and her dedication has been absolute. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Several agents and prosecutors who had worked alongside Sarah for months stared at her with new understanding. The quiet, helpful researcher they had barely noticed was actually the operation's key investigator. Morrison continued, "Sarah's background includes graduating first in her class from Harvard Law School, clerking for a federal appeals court judge, and completing specialized training in financial crimes investigation. She volunteered for this undercover assignment because she understood that her appearance and age would allow her to gather evidence that experienced agents never could." One veteran FBI agent shook his head in amazement. "You've been sitting in our meetings for months, and I thought you were just taking notes." Sarah smiled slightly. "I was taking notes. Very detailed notes." Outside the courthouse, the media waited for what they expected would be a routine press conference about criminal charges. They had no idea they were about to witness the revelation of one of the most successful undercover operations in federal law enforcement history. As Sarah prepared to step into the spotlight, she thought about all the people who had underestimated her, dismissed her, and treated her as invisible. In a few minutes, their assumptions would be shattered forever. The federal courthouse steps were packed with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers as Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison approached the podium. Sarah stood slightly behind him, still looking like a junior staff member rather than the star of the operation. "Today, we announce the conclusion of Operation Silent Justice, a 2-year undercover investigation into corporate corruption that has resulted in charges against 43 individuals and 7 companies," Morrison began. The crowd of reporters leaned forward, scribbling notes and adjusting their cameras. This was clearly a major story, but they had no idea how dramatic it was about to become. Morrison continued, "This investigation was successful because of the extraordinary work of one person who infiltrated this criminal network by hiding in plain sight. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Special Legal Consultant Sarah Mitchell." Sarah stepped forward to the podium, and a murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Several reporters exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected to see a seasoned federal agent or experienced prosecutor, not a young woman who looked like she had just graduated from college. 2 years ago, I began working undercover to investigate allegations of widespread corruption in corporate contracting, Sarah said, her voice clear and confident. "My assignment was to document evidence of illegal activities while maintaining deep cover within the business and legal community." At Henderson and Associates, the partners watched the press conference on television with growing horror. Mrs. Chen's face went pale as recognition dawned. "That's her," she whispered. "That's the girl who interviewed for the junior associate position." Mr. Henderson stared at the screen in disbelief. "The woman we rejected? She's a federal agent." Mr. Rodriguez grabbed his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. "We need to call our lawyers immediately. If she was investigating us." On television, Sarah continued her statement. "During my investigation, I worked in various capacities at multiple companies and law firms. I served as a temporary paralegal, administrative assistant, and legal intern. In each position, I was able to observe and document criminal activities because the subjects of investigation did not consider me a threat." The camera zoomed in on Sarah's face as she delivered the most devastating revelation. "The evidence collected during this operation includes recorded conversations, financial documents, and email communications that detail systematic bribery, money laundering, and fraud involving millions of dollars in government contracts." Back at the courthouse, veteran crime reporters were frantically checking their notes and making phone calls. This was the biggest story of the year, and none of them had seen it coming. Sarah answered questions from the press with the same professional competence she had displayed during her undercover work. When asked about the challenges of maintaining her cover, she replied, "The most difficult part was watching illegal activities occur while being unable to intervene immediately. However, building a comprehensive case required patience and careful documentation." A reporter raised her hand. "How were you able to gain access to sensitive information without arousing suspicion?" Sarah's answer was both honest and damning. "People consistently underestimated my capabilities based on my age and appearance. Senior executives and partners would discuss confidential matters in front of me because they assumed I lacked the knowledge or authority to understand the significance of their conversations." Detective Santos, watching from the crowd, felt a surge of pride for her colleague. She had known Sarah's real identity from the beginning and had watched her endure countless dismissive comments and condescending treatment while secretly building one of the most important cases in federal law enforcement. Morrison returned to the podium to conclude the press conference. "Thanks to Agent Mitchell's work, we expect to recover over $50 million in stolen funds and prevent future fraud worth hundreds of millions more. This investigation demonstrates that justice can come from the most unexpected places." As the press conference ended, Sarah's phone began buzzing with calls and messages. Word was spreading rapidly through the legal community, and everyone who had ever interacted with her was suddenly remembering their conversations in a new light. The quiet, inexperienced young woman they had ignored or dismissed had been listening, watching, and recording everything. Their assumptions about her had become their downfall, and there was no way to undo the damage their arrogance had caused. Within hours of the press conference, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly. Law firms, government agencies, and media outlets all wanted to speak with the woman who had pulled off one of the most successful undercover operations in recent memory. The first call came from Dean Patricia Williams at Harvard Law School. "Sarah, we've been following the news coverage. The law school would be honored to have you speak to our students about your work." The irony was not lost on Sarah. Just days earlier, she had been rejected for an entry-level position. Now prestigious institutions were competing for her attention. At Henderson and Associates, the situation was spiraling out of control. Mr. Henderson sat in his office with his criminal defense attorney, reviewing the evidence that Sarah had gathered during her brief interaction with their firm. "She recorded our entire interview," Henderson said, his voice hollow. "Every dismissive comment, every assumption we made about her capabilities. It's all going to be used as evidence of our arrogance and carelessness." His attorney reviewed the transcript grimly. "The prosecution will argue that your attitude toward young lawyers demonstrates a pattern of believing you're above scrutiny. It doesn't look good." Mrs. Chen paced her office, trying to remember every conversation she had ever had in front of temporary staff. How many times did we discuss confidential matters in front of paralegals and assistants? How many times did we assume they weren't paying attention or didn't understand? The answer was terrifying. Countless times. Meanwhile, Sarah was meeting with FBI Director Rebecca Torres at the federal building. Torres had flown in specifically to congratulate Sarah on her work and discuss her future career options. "What you've accomplished is extraordinary," Torres said. "You've shown that traditional assumptions about experience and expertise can be completely wrong. The Bureau would like to offer you a permanent position as a special agent." Sarah listened carefully as Torres outlined opportunities for advancement that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. "I appreciate the offer, Director Torres. I need some time to consider my options." As news of Sarah's real identity spread, the legal community was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own biases and assumptions. Partners at major firms began reviewing their hiring practices and questioning how many talented individuals they might have overlooked. Judge Margaret Foster, who had presided over several cases where Sarah had appeared as a student observer, called her chambers together for an emergency meeting. "That young woman sat in my courtroom dozens of times. We all assumed she was just another law student taking notes. She was actually conducting a federal investigation." The judge's law clerk shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own dismissive attitudes toward the quiet observer in the back of the courtroom. That evening, Sarah attended a community college class one final time. Her fellow students had seen the news coverage and were struggling to reconcile the federal agent on television with the helpful classmate they knew. "Sarah, is it really true?" asked Jennifer. the student she had helped with contract law. "Are you really an undercover agent?" Sarah nodded, maintaining the same gentle demeanor she had always shown. "I couldn't tell anyone about my real work, but helping you with your studies was always genuine. Education is important, regardless of where it happens." The professor, who had often treated Sarah like she was struggling with basic concepts, approached her after class. "I owe you an apology. I clearly underestimated your abilities." Sarah's response was gracious but pointed. "The most important lesson here isn't about me. It's about the danger of making assumptions about people based on limited information." As she walked home that night, Sarah reflected on the dramatic changes in her life. Tomorrow she would begin receiving offers from the most prestigious law firms in the country, the same firms that would have rejected her application just a week earlier. The security guard at Henderson and Associates, who had given her a sympathetic nod after her interview, stopped her on the street. "I saw you on the news," he said with a wide grin. "I always knew there was something special about you. You carried yourself differently than the other young lawyers who came through those doors." Sarah smiled, remembering his kindness during her moment of apparent failure. "Thank you for treating me with respect when others didn't. That meant more than you know." The next morning would bring even more revelations as the full scope of Sarah's investigation became public, and the legal community would be forced to reckon with the consequences of their assumptions. 6 months after the press conference that changed everything, Sarah sat in her new office at the Department of Justice, overlooking the city where she had once been dismissed as inexperienced. The walls were lined with commendations and awards, including the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award and recognition from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The transformation in how people treated her was complete and sometimes surreal. Law firms that had rejected her applications now sent partners to personally request meetings. Universities offered her teaching positions and speaking engagements. Legal publications wanted her to write articles about undercover investigation techniques. Her former professor from community college had called to invite her to speak to his class. "My students would benefit tremendously from hearing about your experiences," he said, his tone entirely different from the patronizing way he had once spoken to her. The most satisfying moment came when Dean Williams from Harvard Law School called to offer her a position as a visiting professor. "We want our students to learn from someone who has demonstrated that real legal work often happens far from traditional courtrooms," the dean explained. Sarah accepted the position, knowing that her story would inspire other young lawyers who felt underestimated or overlooked. Henderson and Associates had been dissolved, following the criminal convictions of all 3 founding partners. Mr. Henderson received a 5-year federal prison sentence, while Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez each received 3 years. During their trials, recordings of their dismissive comments about Sarah's abilities were played in court, highlighting their arrogance and poor judgment. The prosecution had argued successfully that their attitude toward inexperienced lawyers demonstrated a broader pattern of believing themselves above the law. Their assumption that young professionals posed no threat had blinded them to the investigation happening under their noses. Detective Santos, who had worked closely with Sarah throughout the operation, was promoted to lead a new task force specializing in white-collar crime. "Sarah showed us that the best investigators are often the ones who can blend into any environment," she told reporters. The legal community had been fundamentally changed by Sarah's revelations. Major firms implemented new policies requiring partners to treat all staff members, regardless of experience level, with professional respect. The assumption that young lawyers lacked valuable insights had been thoroughly discredited. Sarah's first class at Harvard Law School was packed with students, eager to learn from the woman who had redefined what it meant to practice law. As she looked out at the eager faces, she remembered her own struggles with being underestimated and dismissed. "The most important lesson from my experience," Sarah told her students, "is that competence and wisdom don't always come in the packages we expect. Some of the most valuable insights come from people who others might overlook or underestimate." A student raised her hand. "How do you handle being underestimated now that your reputation is established?" Sarah smiled, thinking of all the times she had been treated as invisible or incompetent. "I've learned that being underestimated can actually be an advantage. It teaches you resilience, forces you to prove yourself through actions rather than credentials, and helps you understand the experiences of others who face similar challenges. After class, Sarah received a call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Morrison with news about a new case. We have another complex corruption investigation that requires someone with your particular skills. Are you interested? Sarah looked out her office window at the city below, where countless young professionals were probably facing the same dismissive treatment she had once endured. Tell me more about the case. As she listened to the details of the new investigation, Sarah realized that her journey was far from over. There were still corrupt systems to expose, still arrogant individuals who believed their positions made them untouchable, and still young professionals who needed someone to prove that experience comes in many forms. The woman who had once been dismissed as inexperienced had become a symbol of the power of being underestimated. Her story would continue to inspire others who faced similar challenges, proving that sometimes the most effective way to create change is to let others underestimate you until the moment you reveal who you really are. Sarah's legacy was not just the criminal she had brought to justice, but the reminder she provided that wisdom, competence, and strength can be found in the most unexpected places, often hiding behind the faces that others choose not to see.